So, the world of Warcraft has changed, literally. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be talking about how Blizzard have almost completely changed how they craft the world itself and what that has meant for the game. This is not a doom and gloom video though. There are pros and cons to all of the different ways that they've done the world design over the years. Back in the early 2000s, shortly after announcing World of Warcraft, even before Warcraft 3 itself launched, the big sell of this game was completely literal. It was to see the world of Warcraft, a series of pretty great real-time strategy games from the late 90s. This was pretty apparent when you look at their original content plan, which involves literally every basic location from the RPGs. It had Northrend, it had Hellfire, it had Black Temple. When we look at the original zones of the game, you then see they're not really designed for gameplay first. Most of them aren't designed to be complex, in-depth navigation challenges. They certainly aren't designed with efficiency of movement in mind. They are also at times rather sparse, at least in comparison to the game's current zones, which are stuffed full of content at just about every corner. Moving on to Outland and Northrend, we once again see zones that feel like they were designed to be places first, with gameplay coming later. Far larger and with a preference towards more open space, at least in comparison to the current zones that we see in the game. Now that really does help those zones be a scale that feels more believable and immersive, but it of course comes at the expense of convenience. Now the gameplay of World of Warcraft has also changed a lot as time has went on. It has became really less of a traditional RPG in favor of having a bit more streamlining and a larger focus on sort of overtly gamey systems. Now, that's not to say that's necessarily a bad thing. If the primary goal was to make a great immersive RPG with, more downtime and stuff like that, then these bigger zones with more space would probably be the better way to go. It gives the zones a grander scale and, importantly, gives the zones' content sort of room to breathe. In comparison, today's zones feel a bit more like a Disney theme park, where a theme is chosen and then really condensed into a very dense, well-crafted area. Looking at games like The Witcher 3, Witcher 3 could be more convenient to play, faster to play, but I think most people would agree that the size of the world there makes a good bit of sense. Plus, it does have fast travel, which is pretty speedy. And then Guild Wars 2 is another good example of pretty large open zones, really some massive open spaces in that game, but that really does mesh better with their game design goal of making the world content feel more important. But once again, Guild Wars 2 has actually one of the fastest fast travel systems I've ever seen in a game. And then there's the topic of flying. These massive open zones like Nagrand were designed with the knowledge that players would be flying over them. This is especially the case with Wrath of the Lich King, where Blizzard were really able to embrace that, and the scale afforded by doing that really allowed them to make unique feeling zones like the Storm Peaks and Icecrown. Moving to Legion and Warlords, of course, they then designed for grounded gameplay in mind. The large scale of Northrend or Outland would probably be tiresome if, we had to spend 6 months just running around the place unlocking flight. What we therefore see in Legion is a completely different type of zone design. These zones are less designed to have you immersed in a big, logically laid out world, and are more designed around gameplay. The running distances from hub to hub are not that massive, but often zones do involve a good bit more navigation work than the older, more simply laid out zones did. There are more twists and turns, there's more verticality, more things that you need to think about when moving from A to B. And the design goal with that really seems to be that, they want you to feel more connected to the world via the actions that you take while you navigate it and the decisions involved. The smaller scale also means that things are more tightly packed together. Now, sometimes this does hurt the overall sense of, grandeur, but it does mean that there's generally something gameplay-related at every turn. Now, the downside of this is that the zones have an overly designed feel, kind of clinical, where they kind of almost feel like a series of quest areas and hubs thrown together, rather than a big, well-designed, realistic sort of open world that has had content put in it. So, great for gameplay, not necessarily great for immersion. Another thing that you'll notice is that most of these prior expansions were larger in terms of their area and also contained more zones. Now, this isn't to say that Blizzard are skimping with the amount of work they're doing on the current expansion. The attention to detail and level of quality is excellent. It's clear that each one of the modern zones has a hell of a lot more work put into it than some of the older ones would have. Now that we have unlocked flight, of course, you do feel like a bit of a god in Legion. You're traveling between world quest areas or just between, regular quests, and it just feels extremely powerful. Unlike some past expansions, we are you know, we're normally covering a shorter distance in Legion, and it's over terrain that is harder to navigate on foot, so flying really is amazingly powerful in comparison. Now, overall, is it a net positive or a negative, this overall change in design? No, I think it's just different, and I think the ideal situation is a balance. Legion on the whole, to me, feels too small and too condensed. On the flip side, though, if every zone was Borean Tundra, we'd be in trouble. Mists of Pandaria did a pretty great job of doing this, actually. Valley of the Four Winds was quite an immersive feeling, lived-in place that had a believable scale. Having an area of just more empty space contrasts the dense areas like the Jade Forest very effectively, and I think is to the benefit of both. Now, this video doesn't exist to say that Blizzard have messed up with Legion. I really don't think that they have. It's more to point out the strengths of both ways of doing things, and to think about how they could be meshed together to give us something that is better than what we have today. And I really do think having some zones with a bit of a bigger scale and a slightly different sort of design to them would be a good idea. Blizzard also do face a far larger challenge. When the game came out, World of Warcraft was the perfect name for it. However, now it's more World of the Broken Isles, which is very much an inherent problem with a progression-based RPG, but I've got to wonder if they'll ever be able to design their way out of that problem. I really like how Legion sent us back to some of the older zones, and it was nice to sort of get the feel of those older zones again, as I covered in this video. So perhaps they'll find ways of doing that again in the future. I actually think that doing that, and succeeding in doing that, would lead to a big surge of interest in the game, as it truly would be a pretty big innovation, or at least it would be an innovation in regards to what we think of as a theme park MMO. Making a massive world that is all relevant in a theme park game is really hard because that's just a scary amount of content, but in a sandbox MMO, developers don't really need to focus on content in the same way that we think of it with, say, World of Warcraft. They instead need to craft a big world and then create systems that interact strongly with each other. And then the net result of all that interaction is really the content of those MMOs. Stuff like having more in-depth professions and economic markets, or perhaps even having systems that operate in a more generally like dynamic manner, where a gameplay system can just be applied across the whole world, rather than the developer having to make bespoke, static content, like say a Legion Invasion or World Quest. I think that embracing some of these ideas and then meshing them into the current game would be the next step along World of Warcraft's evolution, and it's likely the sort of thing that would be needed to put the world back into World of Warcraft. And of course is something that I think would tie in perfectly to the zone design questions that I brought up in this video. Ultimately though, Blizzard are in the fortunate position of having some of the best artists in the business. They've got the ability to continue making excellent worlds for players to explore. So regardless of what direction they go in, I still think the next expansion will nail it with the zones. It's more that I think they might be able to do better if they look a little bit to their past and how they did some things, and then also look a little bit across the wider industry to what some other companies are putting out with their ideas. But that's it for this video. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.